From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
It's been a busy year, from voting questions to moral dilemmas, changes in law, and changes in how law enforcement respond to mental health crises. But what have been the biggest topics of the year? That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. I'm Pilar Pedraza, and this is Kansas Week, our last episode of the year. So we decided to look back at this year and revisit the topics that had you and us talking the most. Now, a reminder, this show is kind of concentrated on politics, so our top list may look a little bit different from other newscasts. This proposal had the entire nation talking at number one. It was a vote on abortion here in Kansas. An issue that was going to be deeply divisive for our state no matter what got even bigger when the U.S. Supreme Court tossed the hot potato of abortion regulation back into the state's hands after half a century of guarding the right at the federal level. Meanwhile, the Kansas Supreme Court had already ruled the state's constitution protected the right to an abortion, leading to a 2-year effort to amend the Constitution, an effort supporters called the Value Them Both Amendment. Despite being on the primary ballot when few Kansans usually show up to vote, we had record turnout, and roughly 2/3 of the red state voters said they wanted to keep abortion rules the way they are right now here in Kansas. So why was this such a big story this year? Well, I wasn't the only one covering it. So were Dion Leffler, opinion editor with Wichita Eagle, and Adam Strunk, the managing editor at the Harvey County Now, and Dr. Russell Arbin Fox with Friends University. You weren't covering it, but you were knee deep in it, along with the rest of us. This was, half of our job this year?
Not just the job of the people in this room, but the job of a lot of people all across the country. After Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court, Kansas was the very first place to put attitudes about abortion to a test in this new environment. And not only did the results of that test have a huge impact here in the state, it had a huge impact across the country. You've got 10 other states where you have constitutional amendments or proposed constitutional amendments to ratify abortion rights going forward. Probably some of those would still be moving forward if things had gone differently in Kansas, but the vote in Kansas absolutely gave a boost to people across the country saying, yes, we can go on the basis of the polling that we know people will come out and vote on the basis of defending these rights.
And yet, despite this vote, we know that the discussion on abortion in Kansas is not over. Anti-abortion activists have been very upfront. They're not giving up the fight. We've already heard of some bills possibly coming down the pike in the next session.
Oh yeah, and we'll always have an abortion bill, no matter what happens, where this goes. There'll be efforts to overturn what the people have pretty much spoken that they want to be, that they want to happen, is to have reasonable access to abortions. The thing that was really surprising to me about this whole vote was just the magnitude of it.
Yeah.
That so many people came out specifically for that. I mean, there were people who had to wait 3 hours after the polls closed to vote in Sedgwick County. That never happens.
No.
And it just, they always say that they should be the ones to regulate this because they are the closest to the people. And the question arises is, then why are you trying so hard to overturn what the people voted for?
Or you're talking about the number of people coming out to vote, and we saw some interesting results as we went across the state here. I mean, you would expect places like Johnson County and Sedgwick County to vote, no, we don't want this amendment. We had a lot of more rural counties doing that as well.
I mean, Harvey County was one of them, and I think that the whole question to me as a journalist and what I'll kind of remember about the story was how it took a really black and white issue, how we covered it, and it made it more of a gray issue, because you had people you talked to who would be well, I might be pro-life, but I think in case of this or this should be legal, and you'd have people on the other side, and it was really interesting to have that issue turn into a far more nuanced issue than traditionally we've covered it, but it also kind of changed the electorate a little bit. Even in Harvey County, like, we saw hundreds of first-time voters who weren't usually the engaged voters getting registered, waiting in line, voting. We had protests outside of our courthouse, which is something that's super common, or at least demonstrations. And it was just an issue that everybody was talking about and everyone had an opinion on.
And that nuance, very, very important, because that is something that's kind of disappeared from the discussion of abortion over the last 50 years or so. It's become, here's the anti-abortion activist, here's the anti-abortion regulation activist, and here's the story. We're going to go home now, but in reality, it is a much more nuanced situation.
The thing that I would jump on there is the way you say, in reality, it's a much more nuanced situation. The fact of the matter is that in a certain sense, we never had the debate in reality before. Obviously, there were all sorts of ways in which both of the major parties staked out positions about abortion. You've had all sorts of state-level regulations about abortion. You've had national-level debates about abortion. But as long as Roe v. Wade was the law of the land, you were never able to deliver that discussion, that argument down to the people in terms of where they actually line up. And once you actually allowed that to happen, you discovered that there were actually an awful lot of Republican voters here in Kansas who are in favor of abortion rights. And some of those Republican voters came at it for libertarian reasons, some of them came at it for a variety of different reasons. You were able to see the nuance, you were able to see the variety in a way that, for better or worse, we hadn't been able to see it for the previous decades.
Well, and the other thing too is that the nuance was baked into Roe v. Wade. First trimester, fairly easy to get an abortion. Second trimester, much harder. Third trimester, almost impossible. And so it was baked into the law, or it was baked into the court decision. And when that court decision went away, that changed the whole picture.
Well, while the results of the primary were a surprise to many, the campaigning wasn't over yet. We still had a general election to get through still. And once again, we had some surprises come election night and the day after. A year or more before the election, pundits called Laura Kelly the most endangered Democratic governor in the nation, up for re-election in a red state after heavy criticism of her handling of the pandemic, especially the quickness to close Kansas schools. Running against her, a Republican who had easily won election to the Attorney General seat 3 times in a row. By midnight, the results were still too close to call, but the morning after, it became clear Laura Kelly had pulled a miracle out of her hat. Another candidate predicted to fail at the polls also managed to pull out a win this November. Chris Kobach, now set to become the state's new Attorney General. He survived a hotly contested primary only to run up against naysayers who expected a repeat of his race against Laura Kelly for governor 4 years ago, predicting he would lose to Chris Mann, a Democrat who few knew. Now, Kelly and Kobach will have to figure out how to work together to run the state. Okay, let's start there. That's probably something that's not going to happen.
No, they'll be at odds for the next 4 years, and there's probably nothing wrong with that. I mean, people like divided government. There's that tension there that keeps it from going too far one direction or too far the other. And in our case, of course, it's only one direction. But I was a little bit surprised by both of those results. But the thing that surprised me was that Chris Mann, nobody had ever heard of Chris Mann before. A couple of months before the election. I had not heard of Chris Mann. Mm-hmm. And, so when you have basically 100% name recognition like Chris Kobach, and you're running against a guy who has basically 0% name recognition, then maybe, you might take that result of have just barely beating him. You might take that result as something to say maybe you need to tone it down a little bit.
Although one thing about Chris Kobach, you know where he stands, and he's not going to change. He's made that very clear. I'm not changing what I stand for or what I'm going to do for anyone. If they want to vote against me because of that, I'll take that vote against me.
Well, he did do one thing. He did do one thing though that I've complimented him on in the Eagle. He picked a very good choice for the Kansas Bureau of Investigation director, Tony Mattivi, who was actually his opponent in the primary. So, you know, I'm hopeful that maybe Chris has kind of thought some of these things through.
I think the other, and maybe I should be doing a better job of it as a journalist, but I think the other interesting story is there are a not small percent of the electorate that voted for Chris Kobach and voted for Laura Kelly. And Laura Kelly was running against an opponent who I found, or at least when I was following the election, I thought Derek Schmidt came off that he was working to run a little bit further to the middle compared to Kobach. And it's just really interesting that there is a chunk of the electorate that said, no, we're good with Chris Kobach, but also let's stick with Laura Kelly. And I always kind of am curious about those motivations, whether it's name recognition, like you said, or something else.
Well,
I can
here's
see
our expert.
a few different things going on here. First of all, in a very real sense, Laura Kelly did not run against Derek Schmidt. She ran against Sam Brownback. And Derek Schmidt, even if he was on some level thinking about, you know, attacking somewhat to the middle or trying to mollify different discontented elements of the Republican base, in the end, he was not willing to come out and say, hey, I'm not a Brownback clone. He was not willing to come out and say, yeah, the Republican Party was in the wrong with this governor. I'm going to chart a different path. He wasn't willing to say that. And so the Brownback accusation, which to be honest was not entirely earned, nonetheless stuck to him. And that moved a lot of voters. Another thing I would bring up in regards to the name recognition thing and the consistency of Chris Kobach, there are Republicans here in the state of Kansas that love the man. There are also Republicans here in the state of Kansas who hate the man. There was a relatively prominent Republican official who I heard at a fundraiser for Matavi talking about how if Kobach is the nominee, then man is going to win. They were convinced that he was going to go down. I think in the end, the idea that you had split voters was maybe really, really important because you had Republicans who maybe felt bad about the fact that they so did not want another Brownback in the office. They were willing to vote for a Democrat, but then they say, but I'm not going to vote for additional Democrats. I've got to vote for Kobach. And so I think in a perverse sort of way, that helped him out.
Well, and there was the Dennis Pyle factor.
Yeah.
Dennis Pyle with his farther to the right than Derek Schmidt campaign. When you take the Schmidt votes and the Pyle votes and you add them together, you get just about you get a fairly small fraction of folks who
But were the Pyle people going to show up if Pyle wasn't running? I mean, did he actually peel away Republican voters that would have voted for Schmidt? Certainly some, but enough to make up the whole difference? I think to a great extent, Pyle was speaking to Pyle's people, and Pyle's people might not have bothered if Pyle wasn't there.
Well, and another interesting point, too, is I talked to a lot of voters who are like, I'm a lifelong Republican, but I feel like Laura Kelly's doing a good job. I don't see why we need to change, horse in the middle of the race right now.
Yeah. No, I agree. Well, I was going to say with the Pyle question, I know the Kansas GOP sure felt that way when they were going after anybody who supported
their job is to cover all of their bases.
Absolutely. But yeah, no, Schmidt was kind of stuck between two rocks and just trying to go in the middle.
The idea about Kelly's overall, perception, I mean, her polling has never been bad. Obviously, there were a lot of people that spoke up a lot about, how terrible closing down the schools were and all of these other things. But the fact of the matter is that she ran a very canny campaign. She focused on education. She allowed herself to, or she did not allow herself to be dragged deeply into a variety of culture war type issues. And, to the extent that you factor those things out, I don't think a lot of Republicans had a lot of, non-ideological rank and file Republican voters had that much of a complaint about how she's done.
Well, yeah, and trying to paint her as an ultra-liberal socialist
It's hard.
just doesn't,
Yeah.
it just doesn't fly.
No, not when we actually have much more liberal Democrats across the state. So,
Yeah.
Well, moving on from the elections, third on our list is a story that didn't even start this year. It began in September of 2021, but the repercussions just kept on coming. We're talking about the death of a Wichita teen while in custody. Cedric C.J. Lofton was a day away from his 18th birthday when he died. His family had called for help when he began having a mental health crisis. He ended up in restraints and then pinned to the floor of the Juvenile Intake and Assessment Center in Sedgwick County. The coroner determined his death was a homicide, but the DA said he couldn't press charges because of state law. In April, we learned a police officer changed his answers on the intake form, potentially keeping Lofton from needed medical attention. In June, his family filed a federal lawsuit against the Wichita Police Department, Sedgwick County, and the officers involved in Lofton's death, saying the officers used excessive force and weren't properly trained in how to handle juveniles in crisis. Meanwhile, the county enshrined a task force to come up with ideas for how to keep this from happening again. The task force learned Lofton was positive for COVID when he died and was dealing with his grandmother's recent death. That's how he had ended up in foster care to begin with. The task force presented 58 recommendations to the county, which includes more protections for foster children, provisions for early intervention in mental health services, and a review of the state's Stand Your Ground law. Of the recommendations, the county has implemented 26. Another 26 are in progress, and 6 remain untouched. And that's according to the task force online dashboard. And I've got to say, having covered this story off and on over the last year, and I know you've covered it some as well, Dion, it really seems to hit the hearts of so many Kansans because they can see their brother, their son, their cousin, their grandchild in that position in an emergency situation.
Yeah, I mean, this exposed really a multitude of flaws. This was the case that, I mean, you had police cutting corners to put him in lockup instead of hospitalizing him. And part of the reason that they did that, I think, is that there really aren't a lot of, there really isn't a facility for somebody like this. We have, very limited treatment capacity. We've got people in the juvenile intake center who just didn't really know what to do with a person who was this combative. But the reason that he was this combative was because of his mental crisis. So, it's going to take a lot of levels here. This isn't something we're going to solve with one task force and one set of recommendations.
We're looking at a lack of training. We're looking at a lack of money and support to get people to training. We're looking at a culture that covers up for mistakes that arise from that lack of money, that lack of training, because people want to protect their own positions. I mean, you talk about how this was a story that really began last year. I fully expect that the ramifications of this story might well be part of this episode at the end of 2023. We have a threatened lawsuit from former Chief Gordon Ramsay, along with some of his lieutenants, trying to expose things that are going on in City Hall that are relevant to reforms that did not take place amongst the police force. You have, 5 years since the police murder of Andrew Finch. You have a lot of things that are still bubbling. And as Dion said, it's going to take more than just one task force to try to peel away peel away the layers of this onion.
And an onion that certainly has moved beyond the metro area, especially as we look at some of the state level issues it's raised.
Well, and I mean, it's hard to watch those videos and not feel something. Like, it's just a strong demonstration. And I mean, it's one thing to write articles. We've all written articles over and over again, like, we need more mental health professionals. We need more mental health beds. We need regulations here. Those are really easy for everyone to gloss over, including ourselves, without a face. I really think that this issue put a face and a really visceral image to people to that issue, and usually that's when you do have changes happen, or you do have maybe some laws that are passed. It usually almost always takes a face, and I would be really interested to see what happens in the future from this.
No. And it is something, as you guys have both mentioned, that we are going to continue to see for a while. So we're going to move on to our next topic, coming in at number 4, epidemic, crisis. Those are the words first responders, hospitals, law enforcement across the state are using about one drug and the death it's causing, fentanyl. It seems like every few weeks we hear a new headline, a series of fentanyl-related deaths in Sedgwick County's homeless community, or another drug bust netting tens or even hundreds of thousands of pills. Doctors saying fentanyl is a drug that can kill the first time you take it, and law enforcement warning they're finding it laced in pretty much every other drug out there. It's in every community, they say, big, small, urban, rural, rich, or poor. And it's hitting every age group, taking infants and teens as well as adults. Families who've lost loved ones saying something needs to happen now. And we know this is something lawmakers have talked about. There was a push to make some major changes last year in the legislature. Didn't happen, perhaps because to a great extent we're just now starting to hear those personal stories, like you mentioned, putting the face to the tragedy.
Yeah, I mean, these are tragic stories. And it fits in with what we just talked about, frankly, because in a lot of cases, mental health and addiction go hand in hand. And it's nice that we have PSAs warning people not to take, street drugs because they're probably laced with this stuff. Thank you, Bill Self, wherever you are. It was a good TV spot. But it's like the problem runs so deep. I think the only way to address this is going to be a law enforcement solution, and that's going to be very expensive. But getting these drugs off the street, getting these drugs out of circulation, that's going to be the way to do it, because when a person is in the throes of addiction, they're going to take that pill.
Yeah. Well, and talking about the law enforcement response, I would argue that really the only solution to this is going at that mental health crisis that we're having across the state and dealing with the shortages, because historically, when there is a demand, somebody will figure out a way to supply it. So as long as the addiction is there, as long as the demand for that drug is still there, somebody's going to figure out a way to get it.
Well, in tying on to the law enforcement, there's also a legislative aspect. Like, look, people aren't going out saying, like, give me a pill of fentanyl. I want a pill of fentanyl. They're saying, hey, I need some opioids because I'm addicted to opioids. I'm either using heroin or I'm trying to get actual pills. Well, then you're having like Oxycontin, Percocet, stuff is sold like it's laced with fentanyl, because then you can sell it a lot cheaper and the people can make more money on it. Like, it's being fueled by an opioid crisis and people not being able to afford their addiction. And so, like, there's still legislative action that might be able to be taken to kind of address this ongoing opioid crisis. I see these two issues as hand in hand.
Definitely, yeah. And everybody I've spoken with who's on the front lines of it has said the same thing. The opioid crisis and the fentanyl problem is definitely one and the same. Well, at number 5, we talked about it, and then talked about it some more. Finally, lawmakers did something, and Kansans were quick to jump on the bandwagon. Federal law changed to allow the placing of bets on sports games in progress when the U.S. Supreme Court struck down federal prohibitions back in 2018. But while some states were quick to react, Kansas lawmakers couldn't quite reach a consensus on how to do it, although they all said they wanted it. Year after year, they talked about it, worked out compromises on one issue only to get hung up on another one. Finally, this spring, they pushed a bill through, setting up legal sports betting in Kansas. And while many said bets wouldn't be able to be placed until December, maybe even January, by September, the governor was placing the first legal bet in our state. And Kansans were quick to join her. Each month, the amount of money operators are making off the bets has jumped from $1.2 million in September, nearly $8 million in October, to $10.5 million in November, with the state getting about 10% of that. Big deal, big numbers, getting bigger every month. And yet there's one set of numbers we're not seeing, and that's on the other side of this coin, the issue with problem gambling. A lot of predictions that this would increase that.
Well, anytime you make gambling more excessive, you're going to have more problem gambling, but that's still a fairly small fraction of the population. I mean, we have, we allow alcoholic beverages to be consumed in this state, despite the fact that we know that X percentage of people are going to become alcoholics. It's just kind of, it's part of the price of living in a free state, I guess.
Speaking of prices, if folks haven't read some of the articles or want to do some additional reading, the New York Times has done some really interesting reporting on how this got legalized in Kansas. The Reflector's written a bit. I don't know if the Eagle has. Maybe you guys have run some stuff too, but some of that follow-up reporting is really interesting, and seeing how the sausage gets made, because this wasn't all on the up and up. Like, am I saying I'm going to, place a sports better too? Heck yeah, like whatever. But like, this all wasn't on the up and up.
I mean, I will just be the moralistic one. I mean, the very first vote I made in Kansas when I moved here nearly 17 years ago was a vote here in Sedgwick County about the casino. And I don't like the government involved in gambling. I don't like them, having their finger on the till, even if they claim that, oh, look at the money that we're going to be able to move into education. Look at the money that we're going to be able to move into this. It always will involve. Yes. It's bad public policy, and it's always going to involve the kind of corruption you talk about. It's going to invite the kind of addictions you talk about. Does that mean that overall it isn't worth it? Yeah, we're in a free society, so you have to put up with this. But I'm just going to be the grump here about these things.
Well, Mr. Grump, we're going to leave that. That was my top 5. You guys may or may not agree with me on that. What did I leave out? What else should we have talked about today? Diane, why don't you start?
KU winning the national championship.
Well, you just made all the Jayhawks in the audience happy.
But that was a great thing for this state. It absolutely was. It really brought this state together, even with our our ongoing K-State, KU, WSU thing. But not only did they win, but they won in the best way they possibly could. Yep. The other team's star player got hurt. He's hopping around on one leg. KU could have taken advantage of that, but they stopped the game to take him out. So
very, very quickly, we're running out of time.
Okay, well, I would say the Panasonic decision and all of the sausage getting made on the legislation around that was highly interesting, and I think can be written about for years to come.
And I think it will be. Russell?
I look forward to seeing how some of the steps that Wichita and Sedgwick County are taking in terms of sustainability, the Food and Farm Council and the like, will affect things going forward.
All right. Well, been much to talk about, and we will do it. That does it for today and for this year. Once again, thank you for joining us, and thank you for watching Kansas Week. Stay safe and have a great new year.